Hey guys, this is Darren again from Impact, and this is our third installment of Grace Under Fire. This particular part of the story, as we pick up where we left off, which was Genesis 39, verse 20, 21, and 22, we see that Joseph finds himself now in prison. Potiphar's wife had accused him of rape. He did not commit the rape. He literally ran from her. He left his clothes in her possession. And so Potiphar, when he comes home, his wife concocts this story and said that the Hebrew slave, he tried to make sport of me. Potiphar doesn't want to hear anybody's side of the story but his wife's side, and so he tosses Joseph into prison. The Bible says that Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were. And he was there in the prison. But in verse 21, it starts out by saying, "But the Lord was with Joseph, and God showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And everything Joseph touched was successful." We see a common refrain, a familiar refrain here, which is the same old story with Joseph. The Lord is with him. The Lord is with him. We also see that the same favor that God showed Joseph when he was in Potiphar's house is the same favor that God showed Joseph while he was in prison. In verse 22, it says, "And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever they did there, it was all his doing." The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority. This sounds very familiar. This is exactly the kind of language that we see being used to describe Joseph's experience in Potiphar's house. Potiphar put him in complete control over everything because the Lord was with him. And here, once again, we find the keeper of the prison put in everything under Joseph's care. Why? Because the Lord was with him. And so we see this familiar refrain where God is consistent with the people who are connected to him. And so because we know that God is always consistent, we ought to check ourselves and really take our own personal spiritual inventory and ask ourselves the question, am I consistent with God? The question is never whether or not God is going to be consistent. The question is, am I going to be consistent? Which then releases God and allows God to be consistent in our lives. Too many times when things don't happen as we would like for them to happen, when we want for them to happen, we turn to God and we begin to question God as to whether or not he's still high and lifted up. We question him as to whether or not he still cares for us. Well, but really the question should be an internal question. Am I connected to God? Am I still in relationship with God? Once I'm able to answer that question in the affirmative, then we know that God, he's a promise-keeping God, and he's bound by his word. He will keep his word. And so here we find in Genesis 40, as we transition into the story, Genesis 40, there were two prisoners in the prison. And Genesis 40, verse 8, they came to Joseph and they said to him, "We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter for our dream." Joseph said to them, "Do not interpreters belong to God?" And he says, "Tell me the dream, please." The lesson here is a very important one, because we see that even though Joseph went from Potiphar's house to now the dungeon, Potiphar's house to now the prison, and yes, to add insult to injury, he was still a slave, we still see him on the job. We still see him being consistent. We still see him displaying a level of work ethic that most of us will not display. When life hits the proverbial fan and the mess of life starts splattering all over our faces, that's when we begin to look inward. Oftentimes we're not very cognizant of God's presence. we don't want to hear about God. We don't pursue godly things because we feel lower than a worm's belly. We feel as if life has pulled the rug out from under our feet. But here we see Joseph still consistently doing God's bidding, doing God's will, consistently remaining on mission. And I believe the lesson here is a stark one for us to really consider, that especially when life serves us lemonade, God still requires us to be faithful to Him, to be faithful to His work, to be aware of the needs of other people. Because could it be God is sending people to us when we need Him most? He's sending people to us when we don't feel our best, when we don't feel like praying, when we don't feel like singing, when we don't feel like being a Christian, when we don't feel like being pleasant and kind and having a pleasant disposition about ourselves. This is when God, it seems to me from the story of Joseph, this is when He sends people our way to make sure that He gives us an opportunity to be consistent so that He also can be consistent in our lives. And so I love the fact that Joseph, he displayed a level of consistency and work ethic, that even when he was in the absolute worst of circumstances, he still was consistent. He still did what God required of him. So much so that in Genesis 41 verse 16, when the two prisoners found themselves in front of Pharaoh, Pharaoh himself had a dream. And the only person who could interpret Pharaoh's dream was Joseph. And we see the beginning of God finally bringing Joseph out of that pit. He didn't know that he would be standing in front of Pharaoh, shaven and cleaned up, now interpreting the king's dream. And we finally see that God's plan came to fruition in that Pharaoh was brought out of prison to interpret Joseph was brought out of prison to interpret Pharaoh's dream, and that became his ticket out of prison. And so the lesson simply is this: God honors those who honor Him. God keeps His word. And we are the ones who really need to make sure that we are consistent with God so that God can be consistent with us. He does have plans for us. And if we could just get out of our way sometimes and stop short-circuiting God's plan for us, then many of us will find ourselves much further ahead in life than we are right now. The problem is not God. He's always on the job. He's not asleep. The problem always is me. The problem is you. The problem is how we oftentimes short circuit and stand in the way and get in the way and don't allow God to be God. Don't allow God to work out his good and perfect will and plan for our lives. And so just wanted to encourage someone again today with this message as we continue our series, Grace Under Fire. Joseph was the embodiment of grace under fire. I pray that in your lot, in your station, wherever you are today, that you will remember, even though things may not be perfect around you, God still expects you to be the exemplification of a child of the King. God bless you today.